I'm a historian at Ball State University, and today I'm here to talk about the original New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt. What I want to do is just sort of give you some highlights to help us think about the things that made it possible for Roosevelt to make such a fundamental change, and some of the challenges that he faced, some of the ways in which the New Deal was not as successful in thinking about social justice, so that as we're thinking about moving forward with the Green New Deal, we have that kind of background, that kind of historical information to help frame our discussions. So when Franklin Roosevelt took office in 1933, the Great Depression, which was and still is the worst economic downturn in the history of the country, was at its height. Unemployment was at 25%, which is just an unbelievable number. Billions had been lost from the economy, and the economy had been set up in a way that sort of every bad thing that happened caused cycles of more bad things to happen. So as I was listening to Jen talk about the ways that melting polar ice caps mean then that we get more heat in the atmosphere and it just keeps cycling, this sounds very much to me like the New Deal, when job loss led to people having less money to put into the economy, which led to more job loss, which went on and on and on like that. So Herbert Hoover was the president when the when the Great Depression started, and he took the approach that all of the presidents before him had taken to economic downturns, which was a more or less laissez-faire approach, the idea that the economy would eventually right itself. That had more or less worked in some pretty bad downturns through the late 19th and early 20th century, although Matt had asked about the generosity of billionaires. And in fact, JP Morgan single-handedly bailed out the US economy twice, which turned out not to be a sustainable way to plan our economic future. So when FDR came into office, he did not actually come in with a clear, solid ideology. The first New Deal, we divide the New Deal up into the first and second New Deal. So the first New Deal is emergency measures, and FDR is basically willing to try anything. His brain trust, which is his collection of experts, included experts in their field who fundamentally disagreed with one another, and he listened to all of them, and sometimes was willing to put forward contradictory legislation just to see what would work. And the reason that this was possible, the reason that he was able to pass so much legislation in his first 100 days, that's where we get the first 100 days as a measure of a presidency, the reason he was able to pass so much legislation was that everyone agreed that we were in a time of crisis. Not everyone loved FDR. Some people actually literally believed he was the Antichrist, but everyone agreed that this needed to be solved. And so he was able to take Congress, which is a body designed to slow things down, to consider solutions before passing them too quickly. He was able to make them move really fast because people acknowledged that something had to happen immediately. So he comes into power again, his second election, and with the second New Deal says we need to start making some of these things permanent. So by this time, he's become convinced of a particular ideology, of the idea of an economic approach that focuses on consumers and how consumers interact with the economy. And he says we need to have a bigger government. We need to have a government that can support people, that can create a social safety net, and he wants to make these changes more permanent. Now, the first New Deal has caused the economy to rise a little bit, has caused some recovery, and he starts to face more opposition at this point, because when he was talking about emergency measures to deal with something that we all agree is a problem, people are a little bit more willing to work with him. When he's talking about fundamentally changing the government for the rest of the future, he faces more opposition, as we can imagine. Even so, it's under the second New Deal that he passes some of the most important lasting legislation, including the Social Security Act, which is still with us, and the basic building blocks of the welfare state, including aid for family with dependent children and a number of other programs that continue to be with us today. So if we sum up the New Deal in one sentence, we can say that it fundamentally changed the expectations that people had about the federal government and about what its relationship should be to the economy and to the American people. We see a huge split in the way that people think about the government before and after the New Deal, and most people start to see it as something that actually affects them only after all of these sort of policies are put into place under FDR. But it did not affect everyone equally. And this is where I think it's really important for us to recognize that the emphasis on social justice that we see in the Green New Deal, well, it might seem like an ideological approach, it might seem like something secondary to the environment, is actually really, really important. Because what we saw with the first New Deal, well, the old New Deal that include the first and second New Deal. What we see with the old New Deal is, first of all, it helps big entities much, much more than it helps small entities. So it grows the government, that is a lasting effect. But in terms of industry, in terms of unions, in terms of farms, it's big farmers, big businesses, and even big unions that see the best effects of the New Deal. Just to give two examples, the National Recovery Administration set a new standard for how the government interacted with the economy by setting pricing, output standards, and labor standards. But the people that they had in charge of figuring out what those standards would be were the heads of big companies and big unions. And so, of course, the effects of the policies put in place by the National Recovery Administration were that big businesses and big unions benefited, partly out of maliciousness. They wanted to undermine their smaller competition, and partly just because they were working based on their own experiences of business and of labor, and so their assumptions matched what their needs were. In terms of agriculture, the government began by paying farmers not to produce crops because they wanted to stabilize prices. What that meant was that bigger farmers who already had better resources to sustain themselves through the Depression were able to lay off sharecroppers and migrant workers because they didn't need them to not produce crops, and they were able to reinvest the money in technology that in the long term meant that those people never got their jobs back after the Great Depression. So thinking about social justice is really, really important as we think about these changes. Very last thing I want to say is that there were also ways in which gender and race were uneven, or the effects on people depending on gender and race were uneven from the original New Deal. When FDR and everyone thought about what it meant to be a worker at this time, they thought about a man. And so when they had make work programs, they thought about putting men to work and thought about the industries in which men predominantly had lost their jobs. They also assumed that men would be the heads of families who would then support the entire family, and so women didn't need jobs because men would be supporting them. This is also reflected in the Social Security Administration, which assumed that men would be supporting women. And so when we set up entitlements, which became the things that were hardest to chip away at in the coming decades, entitlements were based around an idea about men being the heads of households, men being the ones who had jobs. We did help women through the New Deal, but we helped them through what was not called an entitlement, but what was called welfare, and what was seen as sort of a generous thing that the government was doing, but not something that necessarily needed to be sustained in a long-term way. So as one historian of women has said, the New Deal set up a welfare state in which men were seen as entitled and women were seen as pitied, but not entitled. Finally, the Democratic Party at this time was split between an increasingly progressive party in the North and a party in the South that was still defined by the white supremacy of what would later be called Dixiecrats. And in order to get the support of the white supremacist Democrats in the South, FDR had to make certain concessions, including excluding African Americans and other people of color from most of the Make Work programs, either by actually excluding them or by putting white supremacists in charge of hiring, and so you knew what would happen there. In the Social Security Administration, the whole point of Social Security is that everyone benefits from it equally. So Warren Buffett is gets as much from Social Security relative to what he puts in as you do. And the idea of that was that it would be hard to chip away at, right? Senators aren't going to want to chip away at something that they also benefit from. But it doesn't affect everyone equally. And FDR agreed to exclude agricultural workers and domestic workers from Social Security. The only people who were excluded from it happened to be the industries in which mostly women and African Americans were employed, and this was on purpose. So in part, the exclusions from the New Deal came from implicit biases, how we thought about work, how we thought about workers. Part of it came from explicit biases, and we need to be aware of both things. And so that is something that's built into the New Deal, but something that I fear that we might start to see as secondary, as removable, and I hope that we don't.